Hello, welcome to this TALC Talks video. This is kind of a little extra, like those things you get at the end, the outtakes from films and so on. And me and Mo are going to be talking in real detail about gesture in this little podcast, although it's really a video cast. And there are different kinds of gestures which have been classified by researchers. It's great what people spend their time studying, isn't it? And there are emblems, illustrators, effectors, regulators, and adapter gestures. And me and Mo are going to try and show you what this means and illustrate how you can use them to really enhance your verbal communications. That's to say, using your non-verbals to support what you say with your words. So Mo, thanks for joining me. I see you're in the Vatican Library there, which is always a good place to start. Um, so tell me something about emblems as gestures. What does it mean when a gesture is an emblem?
You've given a really detailed list of what traditionally is considered body language, and in the podcast we described that non-verbal skills can be divided into the voice itself and the different aspects of how we move our body, our eye contact, and the subset of that is what's called kinesics. And emblems is one part of our gesture movement, which has been studied extensively. So emblems are simply a gesture which replaces a word. So, for example, I may ask you, Avril, are you okay? And you may say, mm. And that's just a replacement for saying, I'm okay. Or I may say, can I carry on? And you may say, mm. And that may mean that, please stop. I'm just going to say something. So, an emblem is simply a direct replacement for a word we may speak. Now, one thing about emblems is while they are used universally across all the cultures, just like some words which may be considered benign in one language can be quite rude in another, an emblem can be equally something which is completely benign and normal, like saying okay in our culture is completely normal and benign. Whereas if you go to places like Russia, it's considered an obscene or a rude gesture. So
Ah,
we have to be careful while we observe, use, and feedback on emblems, just having an awareness that there are cross-cultural barriers to using emblems with these.
right. That's really, really interesting because, for example, in Zoom and in other situations, we use a thumbs up to say everything's okay, don't we? Or we might use it to hitch a lift, for example, in the West. But I know I've travelled in countries myself where doing that to hitch a lift would be considered extremely rude and nobody would do it. And you have to do something a bit more like this instead. You know, you kind of wave at somebody if you want to try and stop them to pick you up. Whereas actually, a thumbs up is quite a neutral gesture in other environments. So it's quite interesting. So emblems are quite concise in a way. They tend to mean literally a word or a thing. What about illustrators though? You know, we say a picture tells a thousand words. What do illustrator gestures do?
Illustrators are the kind of extra trimmings we add to the sentence. So illustrators package the sentence in a much more elegant way. And once again, illustrators are also found cross-culturally. Some cultures and some individuals use illustrators a lot. And we both were saying earlier how we both use our hands quite a lot. And for example, you may use the illustrator to say big. So we may say,
Ah,
I caught a very big fish. And then you may just adjust it to the real fish, not the one imaginary fish. You may accentuate your gesture, so you can say just a tiny bit of milk in my coffee. So what it's saying is you're actually speaking, but you're also using the gesture to illustrate what you're speaking.
right.
Uh, so it
So the
was
gesture
horrifying.
almost creates a picture of the word that you're saying. So a little bit of milk or a very small dose of tablets or something. So you're actually illustrating it that way. And I can see as well how you can get a lot of nuance in that because let's say I say something like, well, I caught a really big fish. Then what I'm really saying is, it's a bit of irony, isn't it? Or a bit of sarcasm to say, well, actually, it was a really big fish, it was this big, and everyone will laugh. So you can use it in a quite nuanced way, or you can say, I caught a gigantic fish. In fact, it's too big to fit in the video, sort of thing. Yeah,
Yes.
okay. So
In clinical
illustrators, though,
commu-
can I just ask you about the cross-cultural thing with illustrators, though?
yeah, the
Because,
illustrators, in as I was saying in the podcast earlier, that Some cultures, they use more than their hands. They may use their head,
Mm,
the head shake. For example, um, in some cultures, nodding can mean agreement. In
mm,
another culture, nodding can mean I'm listening, or it can
mm.
be an encouragement to
To keep
what you're
talking.
saying. Yeah. And in some cultures, sort of the lateral or horizontal head shake to a vertical head shake can mean different things as well.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
illustrators can also, when they travel across cultures, can mean slightly different things. But because the words are accompanying them, there is less
Ah,
chance of getting misinterpreted. So whereas
right,
an emblem, because there are no words to go with it, there is no subtitle, you
right,
just have to understand
right,
what's being
right.
said. One thing about illustrators is that in clinical communication, there's been some research in sociolinguistics, and when they record on multiple clinician patient encounters, they found that the clinicians who use illustrators to convey a diagnosis or a management plan tend to have a much better impact and got better positive feedback from the patient. So I think it's worth, as a clinician, to look at what illustrators we use. And if you don't naturally use them, may consider using them either as a body gesture or maybe taking a piece of paper and drawing a picture. So
Ah,
I'll just give a quick example. I've had patients who get extremely anxious when they've had the cervical smear result, and they may come to me and say, I've just got a letter which says inadequate smear or borderline. What does that mean? Have I got cancer? And
mm,
then I didn't realize I was doing it till I watched a video of myself. And I used to use my arm as a kind of, imagine this is a normal cervix and you've got your screening test happening, inadequate, borderline, CAA1, CAM2, CAM3, and then it goes to cancer. It's good that we caught it now because we can then observe, monitor, and manage it. This physical distancing using the illustrator cannot be always conveyed in the words and seem to reassure them a lot
mm.
more than just words alone. So there are many examples where clinicians do use illustrators to accentuate the message, maybe use it for extra reassurance.
Okay, interesting. And I noticed that both of us used an emblem gesture when we were talking then, where we went like this to say, keep talking. And whereas I might go something like that, which often means it's time to stop talking now, doesn't it? Do you know what I mean? Let's wind things up. And I don't know, I would never, I think it's quite tricky to use a gesture like that unless you're with someone who understands why you're doing it. You wouldn't want to, if you did it with a patient, it would be like saying, shut up, I'm bored of listening to you. But there can be other situations where in a more teamwork situation, where you might be saying, like say if I was at the back of a classroom and you were teaching at the front and we were needing to finish on time, and I might point to the clock and go, it's time to wrap it up. And you wouldn't necessarily take that amiss because we'd be working together to a common aim. But that same gesture of hurry up and stop now would be a very inappropriate one to say to a patient. So it's interesting how we've been, even in our conversation, using emblems and illustrators so far. So I'm going to move on now to affectors. What are affector gestures?
Affect displays are the kind of expressions which we don't consciously have control over.
Mm,
It's not something we do because we want to communicate it, but it's how we communicate our mood. So affect displays can be a downcast eye, your face looking down, or you arrive into the room bouncing up and down, which conveys you're happy, you're jolly about something. It can be you're sluggish and slow and looking down, implying that you're sad. This may not be something you actually want to convey, but it crosses beyond. So this comes into play, especially when you're having a conversation with a patient, because their words may not always convey the fact that they're downtrodden. This is a cue we could recognize. So an affect display is the kind of cue where the clinician will say, you seem to be um, thoughtful, or you seem to be, you look like you may be concerned about something. Am I right? So you just kind of verify that.
mm,
So this is sometimes the conveyor of the affect display is less aware of it than the person observing them.
Right, yeah. And I can imagine that sometimes we almost ourselves leak our feelings, don't we? You know, people can say, "Oh, you seem a bit down today," or something like that, which we're not necessarily conscious of. But also, I think patients can be leaking those kind of things, like maybe they're a bit tense or a bit frightened or a bit sad or a bit upset. And sometimes we feel that I always think we feel it here rather than here. That's an illustrator gesture, isn't it? And sometimes we kind of ignore it because we're too busy thinking. We're thinking, what does this person's pain mean, or what am I going to do about this person's breathlessness? Whereas this other information that they're conveying about with their gestures or their posture about their affect, that's to say how they feel, is also clinical information, isn't it, to be used in the consultation. So that's really interesting, and it's important for us to highlight that for clinicians, this is all good stuff. It isn't just what people tell you about their pain or their tablets that matters. It's what they tell you about their own experience and themselves and their context. And as you say, contextualizing what they're saying in their body language. Well, you're telling me this. You seem quite concerned, though. I notice I'm wondering if you're a bit anxious about this. Can put things into a different perspective. What about regulator gestures? I've got a hunch I know what these mean, but I'm not quite sure. So perhaps you can tell me.
Actually, going back to what you were saying earlier, when you said about speeding things up or asking for permission to talk, it's a kind of an emblem, but actually, where an emblem is a direct interpretation or a direct replacement for a word, a regulator will help to either interrupt the conversation. So, in fact, the kind of get on with it gesture is actually more of a regulator than an emblem.
Got you.
So, these are things where we pause, we are encourage, we ask them to continue, or we may ask for our turn. So, these help to regulate the conversation we are having
Mm,
verbally.
mm.
These are gestures we use to regulate the conversation. So this could be an encouragement to carry on,
Yes,
say
or
some
you,
more.
yeah, tell me more, go on, keep going. Or could I just stop you there for a moment? And I'm thinking of a very important way to use that gesture in consultations, which is sometimes patients tell us a lot of information all at once, or they ask a lot of questions that they might say, is it cancer, doctor? Will I have to have an operation? Will that take me a long time to recover? How long will I have off work? Do I have to have chemo as well? And you're thinking, whoa, there's so much there. And so a little regulator gesture where you can say, look, I just want to stop you there for a moment. This is what the information is I think I've got so far. Now, can I ask you about this? Or there were a lot of questions there. Let's just take them one by one. Is that okay with you? That's a way of regulating the flow of the conversation without just saying, oh God, I can't cope, isn't it?
I agree that sometimes these are not precise descriptions. These are given terminology
Hmm.
to cover the wide range of gestures we use. We don't have to get too hung up on the fact that sometimes a regulator can be an illustrator because we are talking and then saying stop.
Mm,
We may just say stop without having the words to go with it, where
mm,
it becomes a more a regulatory gesture. It can be an emblem sometimes because you're not conveying. It doesn't really matter.
mm.
But regulators specifically are used to regulate the conversation we're having.
Yeah.
Even the head nodding encouragement for patients to open up and give us more information is a regulator.
Mm.
It's more obvious when it's not present. And and then you can see how what impact it has
Yeah.
on the person
Yeah.
speaking. If a person is speaking and the person listening does not show any acknowledgement verbally or non-verbally, that leads to a lot of repetition or
Yeah.
anxiety in the person saying this. So you notice this in consultations where when the doctor is busy thinking about when should I interrupt, what's the next question I should ask, and may not be actively listening to the message, it leads to the person having a much more prolonged narrative than what they originally intended to. And they use different words to say the same
Same
message.
thing. Yeah. That's very interesting because repetition is a very big cause of wasted time in consultations, isn't it? People often ask me, how can I speed up? And I always say that the first thing to do is to make sure you're not wasting time in the first place, because the biggest waste of the thing that makes a consultation long is doing something that you don't need to do at all. And if the patient says the same thing 3 or 4 times, they really should only need to say it once. So all those other times are wasted time, and your gestures and your posture and your feedback, your summary about the facts and the feelings are ways of acknowledging that, which means you can move into the next bit. Okay.
Absolutely.
So what about adapter gestures? What are these all about?
These are really interesting. The adapters are very atavistic gestures we pick up throughout our childhood. These are coping gestures which are very unique to each individuals. I started noticing when I watch somebody on television, especially during talk shows, you see that different celebrities have different adapter gestures. It actually conveys how our body copes with some inner emotion of either an embarrassment, or I'm in deep thought, or I'm actually considering what you're saying to me. These are not conscious, once again, not a conscious expression. So some people may tug their ears, some
Mm,
people will scratch their nose when they
mm-hmm.
ask an embarrassing question. If now that I've got a newly grown beard, then I found myself doing a very philosopher type. I'm thinking deeply, which didn't exist before. I wouldn't stroke my chin like that.
I know.
So adapter gestures are actually a kind of, if you have an emotional dissonance and how your body copes with it as well. So this can indicate some internal distress or confusion in some
Mm,
as well. There
mm,
is no vocabulary for adapter gestures. These are very unique to individuals. But it will be interesting if you think about our family members or our friends. And next time you talk to them, now we'll be watching them very closely and looking for what adapter gestures do they have. We may just put our head in our hands and say, this may also convey, oh, I've had enough, or I've
mm,
had too much, not consciously, where in
mm.
an emblem or an illustrator, you're actually actively communicating
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
These
yeah.
are more subconscious gestures, which happen.
That's really interesting, and it's interesting that you say they're unique to the individual, because clearly people are friends and family that we know well. We've probably unconsciously learnt about their unconscious adaptive gestures, haven't we? So that if certain people do certain things, that means something about their state of mind, and we probably don't even know that. We just go, well, I know X really well, and therefore they seem a bit upset today, or they seem very happy today, or whatever it is. And I think with patients, this is one of the huge benefits of continuity, isn't it? Is you kind of get to know them as an individual, just as they get to know you as an individual. And that probably is partly that you pick up some of their adaptive gestures. So you start thinking, oh, I've seen Rosemary 50 times, and when she's anxious she tends to do this with her handbag or whatever, and when she's more relaxed she takes her coat off and sits down in the chair. So I think this is one of the ways in which we can use that information really to build our relationships as well, by being sensitive to that, and sensitive to the fact that people have individual adaptive gestures. That's a really interesting idea.
Adaptive gestures, as you say, are very big cues and will form part of tuning our learners to observe, understand, and also, as you say, it gives a reason for continuity. And the more you follow somebody up and more you see them, the more you get used to their adaptive gesture, just like we get used to our family members or friends. So these kind of adapters are or can become very important, especially if it's a sign of distress. If
Mm,
a clinician is pursuing a line of conversation which the patient is really uncomfortable with, the adaptive gestures can get increasingly more kinetic, whether
mm,
it's shaking their leg or shaking the head, and can even result in them hugging themselves and saying, I feel assaulted verbally and I
mm,
don't need to take it anymore. So adapters, and in extreme examples, can be a sign of just stop. I
mm.
don't want you to go any further into that line. And
It,
if you ignore that, you can inadvertently upset
yeah,
the individual in front
yeah.
of them.
It sounds like they're good early warning signs in a way, that oh, we're on sensitive territory here, and that doesn't necessarily mean stopping talking about it, but it might mean saying something like, you seem unsure about this, or you're this is quite a difficult thing for you to talk about, or I can see this is affecting you a lot, so that you then give the patient the control over the speed of the conversation, where it goes, and that kind of thing. And think it's interesting that sometimes people are thought to be tactless because they kind of override. They listen to the words, but they're kind of overriding the body language that goes with it. And I think sometimes people miss information too, because if you say to somebody, for example, what's been your biggest concern about these symptoms, a lot of people will go, well, oh, not really, nothing really. And a lot of inexperienced clinicians will stop there and say, okay, there's nothing really there. Whereas an experienced clinician will think there's something massive there, because they're hesitating, they're repeating themselves, they're doing some kind of adapter gesture, um, to say, oh, this is perhaps a bit more painful than I'm letting on, or a bit more worrying than I'm letting on, and allow time for that to evolve into the real concern. And this is not just touchy-feely stuff, because when people tell you what they're really concerned about, it's very often clinically very important too. And this is illustrated in the chapters which are in each module now, called How Do These Skills Promote Better and Safer Care? So I think this has a lot of implications for the way we look after people. Well, thank you. And to those people watching, I hope you've enjoyed watching this. I hope you might watch it again and see how many gestures you can identify, and see if you can understand them. And you can start watching your family, friends, your patients, your colleagues. Great stuff to know about in meetings, because you can often get a feeling about how the meeting's going by watching people's adapters and illustrators and emblematic gestures. And I hope you've enjoyed this little telecast about this
I just
subject.
wanted to add
Oh, there's a
to
final word from Dr.
final word
Hart.
from you, the final word, Freak. What I wanted to say was this has been used in all walks of life, not just in clinical encounters,
Mm,
and it's often part of leadership training and
mm,
presentation skills as well. So what I wanted to say that is, if you're watching this video and thinking about it in terms of consultations, these days clinicians, allied health professionals, others hold many portfolio roles, and as you say, this training on nonverbal gestures is vitally important when you're chairing a meeting, when you're presenting to a bunch of people, or whether you're in a teaching encounter, as much as how important it is in a doctor-patient encounter or a clinician-patient encounter as well.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think it can often help things to run more smoothly in the supermarket as well, for that matter.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much, Mo.
Thank you, Avril.
Right.